This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted in October of 1953. The interview was conducted by Mr. Charles Johnson. The interviewee is Mr. Arthur Criswell, that's Criswell, of Wewoka, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on September the 3rd, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Charles Johnson, Editor-in-Chief of the Wewoka History Times, bringing Mr. Arthur Criswell, who will report to you on Wewoka history. Mr. Criswell, would you tell us about the early government in Wewoka, some of the factors about it and so on?
Well, the early government was set up by the Seminoles, or the Creek Tribe, or the Seminole Tribe, was what we call the tribunal government. That was a government set up by the citizens of the tribe. They had a constitution. They had what we'd call now a statutory law, a code of laws governing the rights and property rights of the citizens of the nation. They had a criminal statute which prescribed punishment for crime that any of the members of the tribe could commit, and those trials or hearing had upon any of matters of property rights or crime were heard before the property tribunal set up by the constitution of the tribe. They had a prosecuting attorney. The one I knew personally, his name was Isaac Bartley. I had an occasion at one time to read some of the laws of the tribe. They were different in lots of ways to our statutory laws of today. They didn't, of course, have as many violations as we have. They didn't have a specific remedy for as many violations because they didn't have very much violation. There were not a great deal of crime being committed other than once in a while there would be a murder. Stealing was not bad at all, very seldom. And of course the punishment for murder is death, or rather after the trial or hearing, they always turned the defendant loose and he'd go home. They didn't have such thing as a bond like we have, or a jail. And then he'd be back on a certain day to be executed, and he'd come back and be here on that day. And if it was such a crime that took his life, why, he'd be executed by a firing squad. He'd be placed up against a blackjack forked tree, which was down here, and shot. If it was a lesser crime, he'd be whipped. I never saw anyone shot. I was present over here under the pecan tree, which sits out here in the courthouse lawn, when two of the tribesmen were whipped by what we call sheriffs or deputy sheriffs of the county, but they were called light horsemen. They had switches, rather heavy, and their hands were tied up over their head, and the rope ran up over the limb of the pecan tree, and they were stretched up, and their shirt that was stripped down naked to their waist, and they were whooped across the back by the light horsemen. I don't recall now just how many licks, but the crime that they committed, I'd say this, that each crime of that type would require so many licks with the switch. They were beaten up very badly, and when they were turned loose, why, they fell down on the ground. Of course, I left. They conducted their proceeding in court, as we'd call it court, in a manner that they were to be complimented. They was orderly, and at no time they ever had any disturbance when they were proceeding to hear any complaints by any of the tribesmen against their neighbor or against any person. Their trials were always orderly and in every way. They had out over the county what we call our marshals or our sheriff or deputies. They had light horsemen. They were intelligent members of the tribe. They rode horseback, most always carried some type of firearms, and they were courteous to any white people, and if they run onto any of their tribesmen who was violating the law, why, of course, they apprehend them just like our sheriff does. They did not have a jail for the drunks which would take place at their place of worship at the various churches they had. They most always took the drunk and tied them to a tree till they got sober, and then they'd turn them loose. There were no fines, such as paying a money fine, in any of their court procedure that I ever heard of. And about the two greatest punishments they had was whipping and executing or shooting them at the blackjack tree they had down there. As I say, there were not much stealing took place. We lived here then, and nothing unusual for us to go away from home and leave our doors all open, and we never lost anything. There were no stealing of the older members of the tribe. They just didn't.
Well, could you tell us about the government in Wewoka when the white men came in here, the early government?
Well, later on, I don't recall the year, but of course the federal government extended the federal government into this town. At that time, I was mentioned before, it was Muskogee. And of course, it continued to be at Muskogee, but later, I don't know, probably 1900 or 1902, why this town, Wewoka, the place, was established as a federal court town by the federal government. And each year, why, a federal judge was sent in here and held a term of federal court of which all people, including the tribesmen, members of the tribes, or any white people, they were punished then under the laws of the federal government and prosecuted by the federal government. And I was rather small, but my father was most always on the grand jury or petty jury, which was convened here when the federal judge came. And as I recall, the first one of the judges was named Suesbecker. And I know I remember seeing him a lot of times being in the courtroom, but I don't recall recall just exactly what year it was, but we were all under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so far as crime was concerned, in addition, though, the law of the tribesmen still prevailed to a great extent. However, they could be punished under the tribunal law, and yet at the same time be arrested by the United States Marshal and tried in federal court and sent to Leavenworth prison, of which many of them were sent. For most of it, as I stated to start, would be for killing, not so much stealing.
What type of government did they have now? I mean, when did it come into existence?
Well, you mean the government governing the Indians at the present time?
No, I'm talking about the white here in Wewoka. What the town government is.
Oh, at the present time?
Yeah.
Well, we have a municipal government here in Wewoka now. At that time, though, this was an incorporated town. And we had a municipal government set up under the federal statutes governing municipalities, townsite being laid off in an Indian country where it was not a state, why it is a territory. And the federal law governed exclusively in the territory where this town was, and the federal statute provided how that a town must be incorporated and its laws and so forth could be made. And during the time just mentioned, why, that's the way Wewoka's government, when the white men come here, was set up. But at the time I was first talking about, I was talking about the tribunal law of the entire nation, the Seminole Nation.
Well, I meant here in Wewoka.
Well, at Wewoka, we had a town site, and we had a charter from the federal government, and we had a municipal government set up under the federal statute, and operated under that, and at the present time we operate under our state statutes as to govern municipalities.
Would you tell us about the oil boom? And by that I mean how the population rose, and about how they lived here then, and some of the income, the vast wealth that was made here.
Well, I could go back, if necessary, to the beginning of the first development of oil in this Seminole County and what is known then as Seminole Nation, and tell you all about the first leasing and the first part of it, but I'll not do that. I know about where what is known as Wildcat Well, or prospecting for oil that was made in Seminole County or Seminole Nation. But I'm speaking now of the well which come in out southeast here, Wewoka, at the what is known now is the Dixie community. That well was brought in by a man named Smith and Guy Buckner. Guy Buckner lived at Holdingville. Smith was not a resident here, but he, through Guy Buckner and perhaps some local people here, blocked up this acreage out there, and that well was drilled. And that was the discovery well in Seminole County, and the first one outside of some 3 wells which were drilled way back in 1900 or 1903 or 4, just west of town, something like 15 or maybe 1,500 feet deep. And they got some oil there, but it was of low gravity and was of no use. Those wells were drilled by the C.L. Long and the Wewoka Trading Company. But this was a major well, came in as a big production. that time, Wewoka was a very small place. Most of the people that is here, we call ourselves the old timers. I, at that time, lived here, most of the time lived at Seminole, but I had lived here before that and went to school here, worked at the depot down here, different jobs here in town, worked here a while at the carpenter's trade here in town with Ernest Bridget. But in 1923, March 17th, when the well came in, I was then an attorney and had offices here in Wewoka. And I went out there and saw the well, went out the next day, and one of the greatest booms of all times began. And it began overnight, and it continued. And I will say the following, the well was brought in on March 17th, and the following October, they must have been 15 or 20,000 people in Wewoka, living in any places they could get to live, doing business in any kind of business houses they could get. The town began a building overnight, and it continued every day and night as fast as they could put up residence and business houses. People came in from everywhere, and activity became so great that it was continuous through day and night, Sunday and all days. And the traffic was so thick up and down the streets that you just couldn't get down the street in any kind of a vehicle. We had no pavement. It was boggy, and it rained a great deal, and the roads were bad. We had no good roads like we have now. And the drilling, the contractors hauling in rigs, starting new wells every day. And it looked like every well they drilled out in that part of the country produced oil. And it became one of the booms of all times. We had come in here to this town, some as fine as citizens, and we have them yet. And a great portion of the people who came here during that boom are living here now and are fine citizens. Of course, we had, as all booms do, we had some rough elements come here that give some difficulty to the officers. But as a whole, the great majority of people who were operating in the oil field, who were working for major companies, were fine people. Our school expanded overnight. We couldn't build brick schools for them. We built plank schoolhouses all over the ground up there where the present school system stands now.
Could you tell us about the about more of that and about more of the how the people lived then during those days, and and also could you tell about the Wewoka High School or any of the schools that you attended? You said you went to school here.
Well, I went to school here in maybe 1902, maybe. Well, I just couldn't say the date. But we didn't have very much of a school. We didn't have very many students. There's not many people here. Mr. Irwin Whitney, who lives here in Wewoka at the present time, was my school teacher. And a lady by the name of Slythe, Mrs. Slythe. We only had 2 teachers, and we only had 1 schoolroom. And that room and building set where the Methodist Church is now built. And I attended school there. There was, Well, I just couldn't say how many students, but I will say that Randall Cobb, who were later Attorney General of Oklahoma, was one of the students, and I had the good fortune to be sitting in the seat with him at school. We had him in pairs, had seats where two sat. And Cecil Dunaway, or Cecil Taylor was then, who lives now in Shawnee, she was one. And the Crouch children, and the Saran children, Joe Saran and his sister attended school there, and Mr. Whitney was the teacher, he and Mrs. Five, and that's all the school was in Wewoka.
Well, was that elementary school or was that high school?
No, that was just elementary. We didn't have no high school at all.
Well, could you tell us any fun stories, any anecdotes, Mr. Criswell, about
Well, the only thing I can tell was what happened to myself. I told this before, I didn't intend to, but since you've asked me, I will tell it. Now, that building was set up very high, off in the ground, the east end of it. Now, I lived out in the country, just out away from town. Well, we were all poor people, very poor people at that, but some of the children in town did have better grub than I had, so we all brought her dinner. That was a very common thing in those school days, bringing the bucket, and everybody sit down to noon hour and eat dinner. Well, of course, the first day or two, I observed that my ration wasn't up to par with the rest of the students. About all I had was big old soda biscuits and old bacon, what's commonly called sourdough. And sometimes mine was cornbread. I didn't have any pie and I didn't have no cake. So I was very much embarrassed with my food, and so I naturally had to study a way out of it. So I'd go around to the east side and go in under the floor and eat my dinner by myself, and none of them knew where I was at till after I had eaten, and then I'd come out. And that actually happened up there. I was very sensitive with my ration. It wasn't just clean up to par as the rest of them. Well, no, that's...
Well, could you tell us, we just have a few minutes more, could you tell us about the early social life? I mean, how the people here, when you were a child, or when you first came here, about how they lived. I suppose you know about it since you were growing up here. Yeah.
Here in Wewoka? Yes. We had the best time in the world. They were myself and Mert Perkins, Claude and Clarence Bunyard, and some others that I could say. And there was an old building which did set right where the Lillard television station is over here, and it had a good floor in it and was empty. Now we had a skating rink in there. We had roller skates, and we kept that busy every night, just like the youngsters do today. On Sunday morning, we went to church and Sunday school up there to this same place where we had school. Now, I don't know whether it was a Baptist, Methodist, it didn't make any difference. We had church. We sang songs, and then in the week time we'd have parties up at Mr. Bunyard's place and out to Ernest Bridget's place, and we just had a good time like the young folks have now, and I see no difference. I don't think the young folks then were any better than they are now, to tell you the truth of it. Now, that was in Wewoka. Now, up in the other part of the neighborhood where I lived, the community life was different. In the wintertime, we square danced in log cabins. I was something like 15 or 16 years old, and I was the chief fiddler for square dances. And that was a lot of fun for the people who moved in and put in the leases and broke out the land and made Seminole County kind of what it is today. Of course, we then had our church services too on Sunday, and the first church house we built, we paid for the lumber by having 4 square dances a week.
So you charged them 2 days?
Yes, we charged and used the money to pay for the lumber to build this church house so we could have Sunday school on Sunday morning.
Well, I sure do thank you, Mr. Criswell, for all this information. If you have anything else to add, we could just use a little tiny bit.
Well, I have in here that I can take off the wall the first jury.
The first what?
First petty jury that's drawn in this county.
Oh.
This concludes the interview with Mr. J.A. Patterson. This concludes side 1 of tape 1 of the recordings of interviews for the Wewoka history.